If you've been considering a high-speed printer, you've likely come across the Creality K1. Now the K1 is Creality's answer to the offerings from Bamboo Labs. And the K1's been out for a little while and I've been using it for a reasonable amount of time myself. And if you guys are familiar with my videos, you'll know that I very rarely, if ever, rush to publish a video just to be first on the YouTube scene to take advantage of the trending search terms. I'd prefer to spend a lot more time with the product so that I can give you guys a real opinion of what I think about it instead of a first impression, which ultimately really means nothing. So follow along in this video as I take you through my experience with the K1. I've got some upgrades for this machine as well as a PrusaSlicer profile that I'll provide on my website, embracemaking.com. You'll find those links in the video description down below. And thank you so much to SainSmart for generously sending me the K1 to make this video possible. They also send me a bunch of their GT3 PLA high-speed printing filament, and we'll take a look at that later in the video as well. So let's get started. First, we'll start with the unboxing, and shout out to my local courier for delivering the box in this pristine form. Now, luckily the K1 was adequately packaged because the machine was not damaged on the inside. Up at the top of the machine in this piece of foam, you'll find the power cord as well as the door handle. You'll need to remove various pieces of tape and protective coverings around the entire 3D printer, as this is protecting the nice finish on all of those acrylic panels. Inside of the enclosure, you'll have to remove some more pieces of protective foam, as well as this box, which includes the touchscreen that goes on the front of the printer, as well as this accessory kit, which contains some basic tools, as well as a glue stick, USB stick, and some side cutters. In this box, you'll also find a sample roll of Creality's Hyper PLA, as well as the filament spool holder that goes on the back of the machine, and some extra feet. The printer comes 98% pre-assembled, so there's only a few things left for us to do, and the first thing is to install the touchscreen. Just remove the piece of protective tape on the front of the printer and you'll find a connector, and this pretty obviously plugs into the back of the touchscreen. And then you'll find two tabs on the back of the screen that engage with slots in the front of the printer, and you'll just insert those and press down. At the side of the machine, please check the input voltage. This is very important. Mine was set to 230. I had to switch it over to 115 with a screwdriver. Then you can plug in the power connector at the back, and you can install the filament spool holder by just twisting it into place. The final piece of the puzzle is the door handle at the front, and you can see two holes in the front acrylic door. There are two screws and two bushings that come with the handle, so I've pre-threaded the screws into those bushings, and then I'm going to insert that assembly into this bracket. This bracket is basically a backing plate that goes on the back side of the door. The bushings will sit inside of the holes of the acrylic panel. You can place the handle on the front and then thread the screws into the back side of the handle. And that's pretty much it. This has to be one of the simplest assemblies that I've done to date. With the assembly complete, there's just a few small steps that we need to take here before we can start printing. So we're going to turn our machine on. We're going to go through the initial setup on the touchscreen, which includes selecting your language. And then it's going to prompt you to remove the three screws holding the print bed down. The three screws you need to remove can be easily identified by these yellow arrow stickers that were installed at the factory. Once you've done that, you can click the next button. Make sure nothing is in the way of the print bed. You're going to be prompted to set up your Wi-Fi network, finish up the time zone settings, and then set up the Creality Cloud binding. Now I'm going to skip this because I won't be using Creality Cloud, and I'm going to move on to the self-inspection. At this point, the machine will go through a self-check and self-calibration, going over several different parameters, including the auto bed leveling as well as the input shaping. So expect to hear some noise from the various fans, as well as watching the print head fly around and then watching the print head vibrate itself through that input shaping process. That process will take a few minutes, but when it's done, I would recommend going into the settings and checking the firmware version. A little red dot beside the firmware version will indicate that there's an available firmware update. I've downloaded the latest version. It says installation success, and then you'll expect that your printer will reboot itself. And now to load some filament, we're going to look at the extruder at the top. We're going to unlock the extruder by pushing the lever to the right hand side. And we're going to unpackage our SainSmart GT3 high-speed printing filament. This stuff is PLA, which is a great place for us to start since PLA is one of the easiest types of material to start printing with. I placed the spool on the back of the machine, fed the filament up through the filament runout detection sensor and into the extruder. With the filament engaged in the extruder, make sure you lock the lever, then in the menu, hit the extrude retract setting, click on extrude, and the printer will take over and prime the nozzle for you. Before we can print, we need to slice some files, and I have a very strong preference for PrusaSlicer. Creality would probably like you to use their slicer, but where's the fun in that? I've made this PrusaSlicer profile available on my website. I'll put the link to that in the video description down below, but you can see here in the printer settings that I have all of the general settings set appropriately, as well as the start G code and end G code to be compatible with the K1. This printer is running Clipper, so there's not a whole lot you need to put in the start and end G code. And in terms of the machine limits, right now I'm only using these to estimate the print time, so they're not being emitted to G code and they're not modifying the speeds or accelerations that have been set in the firmware. The machine comes with a pretty standard 0.4mm nozzle, so that goes unchanged, and the retraction length is set to 2mm. Now usually on most of my direct drive printers, I limit that to 1mm, but for this printer, 2mm seems to work very well. I don't get any major stringing or any hot end jams. Over in the filament profile, I'm using a nozzle temperature of 220 degrees Celsius and a bed temperature of 60 degrees. I won't go through all of the cooling settings here, but you can pause the video if you want to see any specific value. The advanced settings, I've got the max volumetric speed set to 32 cubic millimeters per second, and then we can move on to the print settings. Now these print settings are a very good starting point, but this is the tab where you'll likely be making most of the changes to suit the model that you're printing, as well as the application. Over in the infill section, there is the ironing feature, which I accidentally had enabled for some of the initial prints that we'll see later on. So not to worry, I've disabled this in the profile that's been uploaded to my website. In the skirt and brim settings, I usually like to run one loop of a skirt just to make sure the nozzle is primed before the print starts. And in the support materials, again, I'm not going to go through every setting, but I've done some tuning on that to make sure supports work well for you and they're very easy to remove. In the speed section, I've found that these settings here are a very good balance between part quality and print speed. Now we're not trying to do anything too crazy here, like achieve the advertised 600 millimeters per second, but I find that 300 to 350 is a very good sweet spot for this printer. Now going through all of the ins and outs of how to slice files as well as best practices is outside of the scope of this video, but you can see that I've loaded up a model. I've inserted some custom support settings at the bottom, and I've gone ahead and sliced this file, generating a G-code file. I've saved that file locally, and then in the touchscreen, if you head on over to the network, you can find the IP address of your K1, and you can use this IP address in the web browser on your computer to launch the Creality Print web user interface. You can remotely control your K1 using the web user interface, as well as upload files over your wireless network. Now this user interface leaves quite a bit to be desired, and I'll talk about that a little more in the review section at the end of this video. But for now, if you just click that import button, you can find the G-code file locally stored on your computer, and you can wirelessly upload it to the K1. Once it's uploaded, you'll find the file name in this file list. Files uploaded over the web UI will appear in the local section of the file list. Now, I've also put that same file on a USB drive, and so if you use the USB drive at the front of the printer, those files will appear in the USB section. And so to demonstrate the USB printing, I'm just going to print from the USB thumb drive, and this is the very first print that I've printed on the K1. Normally I would print something smaller and simpler like a calibration cube, but I figured I'd just go ahead and send it since this printer is supposed to be very user-friendly. To date, I've only used a handful of some of these high-speed printers, and it never ceases to amaze me how fast these print heads start whipping around. It's truly incredible how well Klipper's input shaping works, and on this print here, you can see that the print quality turned out reasonably well, although on these top surfaces I end up with these very small blobs, and I found out, as I had mentioned earlier when we were looking at the slicer settings, that I had the ironing enabled, and so by disabling the ironing feature in PrusaSlicer, I eventually got rid of those blobs, but for the first few prints, you're going to see those. So just take note that this isn't a problem with the K1, it was my slicer settings that were the cause of that. The rest of the print looked very nice. Some of the severe overhangs were a little rough, as to be expected. I then moved on to a more complex model of Super Mario, and I wanted to test out the organic supports in PrusaSlicer. Organic supports are much more efficient in terms of material usage than traditional supports, but in the past I've found that they are a little more delicate to print. And so with the print speeds involved, I wanted to see how the K1 would handle the organic supports, and to my satisfaction, none of the supports were damaged or knocked over in the process of printing this model, and Mario turned out looking pretty good. And again, for this print, I mistakenly had ironing enabled, so I had some unwanted blobs, and there were a few sections where in the slicer I should have put some extra support, but still overall the K1 handled this model very well, and Mario turned out looking great in SainSmart's GT3 red filament. If you look very closely, you will notice some very fine stringing, which I refer to as wisps of filament. Normally I get rid of these by post-processing with a heat gun, and it quickly blows those things away. Sticking with the Super Mario theme, another model that I printed here was his brother Luigi. Luigi is taller than Mario, so we're going to use a little more of the Z height on the K1 for this model, and again I'm using the organic supports to support all of the extreme overhangs on this Luigi model. This time, one of the very tiny branches of the organic supports did get a little messed up mid-print, but it seemed to have self-corrected and the rest of the model worked out just fine. On these prints, you'll also notice that at this point, I wasn't using any glue on the PEI print bed, and I had no issues with first layer adhesion with very fast first layer print speeds. Luigi was printed in SainSmart's GT3 mint green, and you can see that this filament does have a very nice matte finish to it, and you'll also notice that unfortunately, again, I still had that ironing feature enabled in PrusaSlicer, and so you'll see some very fine blobs on the top surfaces of the print. Eventually, I promise I will get rid of those. Under the brim of his hat, you'll see that there is some support material that I still need to remove, but otherwise all of the very fine details of this model came out looking great, and I will hit this again with a heat gun to get rid of those very fine wisps. These parts turned out great with their fine details and organic features, but perhaps we should print something with just round faces as well as a mechanical feature such as a thread. I found these really cool mushroom container models on printables, and I'll put a link to them down in the video description below, but I printed these in Polyterra PLA, and you can see this is a wood colored PLA, and it printed just fine on the K1. The round surfaces turned out looking really great. In the future, I would probably change where the Z seam is aligned, but for now you can see that unfortunately some of them ended up on the front of the model, but the threads also turned out looking great, and I printed the mating part, which is the red mushroom cap, also on the K1, and the fit between these two parts was perfect. These mushroom models have a few other small parts like the eyes and the white dots on the mushroom caps that I also printed on the K1 in the SainSmart GT3 white and black filament, and then I went ahead and assembled these just using some hot glue. These parts I appropriately had the ironing feature disabled in PrusaSlicer, and the quality was incredible. I made sure I also test printed more functional threads, this time even finer threads. These are usually a very good test for a printer's dimensional tolerances as well as its part cooling fan because of the overhangs involved with those threads. Overall, the threads looked pretty good, although I noticed I could make some improvements, and so later on I did change some of the parameters in the PrusaSlicer profile to the minimum layer time. Because the printer was printing the threads so quickly, I noticed that each layer didn't quite have enough time to cool. Now, I didn't have that auxiliary fan activated, it was just the par cooling fan, but by changing the minimum layer time to about 7 seconds, I had reprinted this thing again, and I was able to get even cleaner threads later on. But regardless of that, even on this first attempt, I was still able to get the nut, which was also printed on the K1, to engage with the male threads without issue. A lot of the parts that I've printed so far have had curved surfaces. Now, I do want to point out something minor that I have noticed on some of these parts with flat walls. At certain angles, you can see a little bit of a repeating pattern. This isn't a pattern that's repeating in the Z-axis. I believe that it looks to be worse in the X-axis. Now, it is very minor and you can only see it under certain lighting conditions, but I think the culprit is how the belts are routed in the Core XY system. You can see here that Creality has one of the tooth sides of the belts of the Core XY system running on a smooth pulley. Now, it could be completely wrong, but I am guessing that this is what's causing that repeated pattern on flat faces running parallel to the X-axis. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section down below. I went on to print a lot more stuff, and this is just a very small sample of some of the things that I ended up printing on the K1. Many of the functional things that I printed are currently in use, and this is again a small sample of the things that I could find laying around to grab this video clip. Up until the making of this video, I haven't had any major issues with the K1. A few minor things popped up, one of them being the first layer adhesion with the flex plate that comes with the printer, but in the next section of this video, I have a better solution for that anyways. Ultimately, I was able to produce quite a lot of parts with a high degree of reliability. When I first started printing with the K1, I had zero issues with first layer adhesion, even at high speeds. But for some strange reason, that did change over time, and I was forced to start using glue stick to get those first layers to adhere. Personally, I don't think you should have to use glue stick anymore, at least when printing with PLA, so I switched over to one of my custom build plates. It's dimensionally identical to the original flex plate, and it has a textured side on the bottom, so you can get that awesome texture transferred over to the first layer of your prints. And since it's dimensionally identical, it's a direct drop-in replacement for the original build plate. I also wasn't entirely content with the very simple spool holder on the back of the printer. As you can see, it doesn't offer a smooth rotation of the spools, and if you're using these cardboard spools, there's a lot of friction on that surface from the spool dragging on it. So instead, I installed one of these super deluxe spool holders that I offer on my website, and it has the exact same twist lock feature from these Creality spools. So not only is it compatible with the K1, but it's compatible with any Creality machine that uses the twist lock spools. With this design, there's a reduction in the amount of force that the extruder is required to pull that roll of filament. Now, to take things a step further, I also designed this spool stand, and this is called the Spool Stand X. Now, it's not just for the K1, and as you can see here on the two top corners of the Spool Stand X, you can accessorize with things like mounting provisions for Creality runout sensors, as well as this PTFE tube guide. Both of these are on ball joints to make sure that the filament is never being pulled at weird angles. On the back of the spool stand, you'll notice these black rubber feet, and that's because the Spool Stand X can also be run in the vertical orientation. Now, this I did specifically for the K1 so that you could take this spool stand and you could put it directly on top of the lid of the printer, and those rubber feet would not allow the spool to move while the printer is vibrating. Otherwise, if it was just plastic sitting on top of more plastic, you might see the spool stand start to move around. In this setup here, you can see that I've taken a piece of PTFE tubing and I've looped it around the back of the printer into the PTFE tube guide of the Spool Stand X, and that's going to eliminate the spool being on the back of the printer, freeing up a lot of space and decreasing the overall depth of this printer. Now this setup has worked out great for me, but you can also run the Spool Stand X on the side of the Creality K1. In this location, I'm using a shorter piece of PTFE tube, but either way, whether it's the top or the side, it makes access to your materials so much easier than having to go to the back of the printer every time you want to change your filament. I'm not sure what motivated Creality to put the spool holder on the back of the machine, but at least now with the Spool Stand X, you can also gauge how much material you have left on your spool. So far, I've been very impressed with the K1. But if you guys are watching this video, likely you're doing your research to find out if this printer is right for you. And to be completely fair, when I got this thing, I did my own research as well, and I found a lot of mixed reviews on the K1. Now, I do think that a lot of the bad reviews likely were from the first release of this printer. And since then, Creality has fixed a lot of the original issues that came up that the first YouTubers and first customers had with this printer. So since then, there's been some changes and revisions, and I do believe that I have one of the later models based on what I've seen online. So I think that might also be why I've had such a good experience with this thing. And by the time this video gets released, likely they are going to be shipping out only the later revisions of this printer. So if you buy a K1, hopefully you'll have a good experience. It's also worth mentioning that I've seen a lot of mixed reviews on the Bambu Labs printers as well, and I think they went through the similar sort of initial development process of issuing revisions to their product to correct some of the earlier problems they had with the first models that they came out with. Now, I think there's a bigger issue here though with these high-speed printers, and it has nothing to do with their design necessarily, it's more about how they're being marketed. I think these printers, whether it's the K1 or anything from Bambu Labs, these companies are trying to make 3D printing look a little easier than it actually is. And despite the new machines having all of the bells and whistles, there's still a pretty steep learning curve to 3D printing. And if you start to experience any sort of problems and you don't have any sort of foundational experience or knowledge, it's really hard to troubleshoot. And I think that's also where a lot of the bad reviews come from for some of these printers. Additionally, when you factor in the high-speed nature of these machines, you start to push the mechanical design as well as the materials to new limits, and you're bound to experience more problems, and that's also going to lead to a lot more bad reviews for any brand. And so if you're a beginner, I think there's a lot of value in starting off with a simpler, lower cost machine, something even like an Ender 3, where you get the opportunity to build some fundamental 3D printing experience and knowledge, and then you can move on to something faster and more complex like the K1. Kind of the same way that you wouldn't start your racing career in an F1 car. Plus, by learning those fundamentals and building that foundational knowledge of 3D printing on a very basic machine, once you move on to a more complex machine, it makes it a lot easier to troubleshoot printing problems as well as even mechanical problems if you ever have to repair the machine yourself. But regardless of if you're a beginner or an advanced user, if you end up with a K1, you have a very capable machine in your possession. I was really satisfied with the print quality of everything that came off of this printer, especially considering the speeds and accelerations at which I had the prints going. And I was also happy with the initial setup, which again, my machine worked out great. So it was easy to use and it was very hands-off in terms of tuning this thing. Another thing I like about the K1 is its compact size. Now, if you compare it to something like an Ender 5 S1, which has roughly the same build volume, you'll see that the K1 is a little smaller. And if you remove the spool from the back of the machine and use that spool stand that I showed you guys earlier, the depth of the machine is greatly reduced and you can fit the K1 on most shelves, desks, or tabletops. Plus, if you take a look at the K1 versus, again, something like an Ender 5 S1 or an Ender 3 S1, the K1 has an enclosure, which is really nice, but the enclosure obviously provides benefits in terms of printing more advanced materials, but also just the way that it looks. The K1 is a much more polished product than something like the Ender 5 S1 or Ender 3 S1. In terms of filament for the K1, I had a very positive experience with the GT3 PLA from SainSmart. I really liked the matte finish on the parts, and I had zero issues when it came to under extrusion or hot end jams. And considering the print speeds involved, I was printing on average at about 350 millimeters per second. the parts came out reasonably strong. Now, I did also test some other filaments from other brands, and they also worked fine with the K1, so don't feel like you have to be locked into high-speed printing filament, although it does in this case work out very good, but there are options out there for you. Now, if I could change a few things about the K1, the first thing I would change is the location of the spool. It's very inconvenient at the back of the machine, and that's the whole reason I designed that Spool Stand X, which you can see here right now sitting at the side of the printer, but again, can be located on the top to make filament changes a lot more convenient and just a lot more easier to even see how much filament that you have left. The second thing is that I wish Creality would, from the factory, include a hardened nozzle. If you're gonna print with more abrasive materials, which likely a lot of people are these days, carbon fiber materials are very popular, swapping out the nozzle is just one more thing that you have to deal with. And as of right now, there's not a lot of options, it seems, for hardened nozzles for the K1. I'm sure a lot of companies are gonna come out with those soon. And the third thing that I would change is the flex plate. The one that is included with the machine seems to be PEI coated, but for some bizarre reason, after a little bit of use, I had to start using glue stick to get my prints to stick. Now, eventually, as you saw, I also swapped that out for a PEI coated flex plate from my website, embracemaking.com. The ones that I offer are a lot higher quality than the one that comes with the Creality machine. And as an added bonus, the second side of the flex plates that I offer are textured, so you get that awesome looking imprint on the first layer of your prints. And the fourth thing is I wish Creality would make the full fluid interface available as the default web UI instead of the stripped down Creality print version. And I think that's something that they could do in a future release of the firmware. I know personally, I would really want that. I mean, even the Sonic Pad, which is another Creality product, which also runs Clipper, has a much more advanced web UI. Now, in the meantime, there are ways to achieve this. There are some recent releases of community-built firmware that will do that for you, or there's some more advanced techniques that you'll find on YouTube or through some Google searches where you guys can activate the fluid interface on the K1. That's something that I'll be doing after this video. Obviously, for this video, I wanted to test the printer as it was, including the web UI from the factory. So that sums up both the pros and the cons of the K1. Again, I want to thank SainSmart so much for generously sending me the K1 and their GT3 filament that made this video possible. Please go check out their website. I'll put some links in the video description down below. Also, be sure to check out my website, embracemaking.com, where you'll find the various upgrades that I showed you guys in this video, as well as the PrusaSlicer profile for the K1, because right now that's a little bit difficult to find. So you'll find that on my website. Again, link in the video description down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.